A black boy is unjustly humiliated by the police, but they didn't know who his father was. Hello, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories. The scorching August sun beat down on the immaculate asphalt of Oak Ridge Heights, a luxury condominium on the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia. The imposing mansions, with their exposed brick facades and meticulously tended gardens, exuded an aura of privilege and exclusivity. It was a haven for the wealthy, an oasis of tranquility away from the hustle and bustle of the big city. On that sweltering afternoon, Elijah Johnson, a young black man of 15, walked nonchalantly along the sidewalk shaded by centuries-old oak trees. His slender body moved with the natural grace of a teenager, his headphones isolating him in his own world of rhythms and melodies. He wore a simple white t-shirt, khaki shorts and branded sneakers, ordinary clothes for any boy his age. What Elijah didn't know was that his mere presence in that exclusive neighborhood was about to trigger a series of events that would shake not only his life, but the foundations of that seemingly idyllic community. "Get out of here, you young nigger!" The shout cut through the air like a razor, making Elijah stop in his tracks. Confused, he removed his headphones, looking for the source of the sudden hostility. It was then that he noticed the stairs. Curtains moved discreetly in the windows of the surrounding houses. Faces pale with fear and suspicion watched him. An elderly woman on the porch next door clutched her purse to her chest, as if her mere presence posed a threat. Before Elijah could process what was happening, the shrill sound of sirens filled the air. 2 police cars came around the corner at high speed, braking sharply a few meters from where he stood. 4 officers jumped out of the vehicles, guns drawn. "Hands up! Don't move!" Elijah's heart raced. His mind panicked as he tried to understand what he had done wrong. He raised his trembling hands, feeling exposed and vulnerable. "I didn't do anything," he stammered, his voice failing. "Please, I'm just walking." But his words fell on deaf ears. The policemen advanced, their faces contorted in a mixture of fear and aggression. In a matter of seconds, Elijah was thrown to the ground, the hot asphalt burning his cheek as a knee pressed into his back. The brutality of the scene played out like a nightmare in slow motion. Tight handcuffs bit into his wrists. Harsh words and baseless accusations were spat in his face. Elijah tried to explain, to plead, but every attempt to speak was met with more force, more violence. Around them, a small crowd was beginning to form. Some residents watched the scene with a mixture of relief and indifference, as if the presence of the police confirmed their worst fears about the young black man in their neighborhood. Others, however, watched in horror, unable to believe the brutality they were witnessing. Among the murmurs of the crowd, one voice stood out. A middle-aged woman with gray hair and thin-framed glasses stepped forward. "Wait! I know that boy!" she shouted, her voice shaking with indignation. "He's Dr. Johnson's son. He lives here." A stunned silence fell over the scene. The policemen exchanged confused glances, their hands still firmly gripping Elijah. The mention of Dr. Johnson seemed to change something in the air, as if an invisible veil had been lifted. Dr. Marcus Johnson was a well-known and respected name not only in Oak Ridge Heights, but throughout Atlanta. A renowned heart surgeon, philanthropist, and active member of the community, he was a figure who transcended the racial barriers so deeply rooted in that society. The revelation of Elijah's identity cast a cruel light on the prejudices and assumptions that had led to that moment. The young man who moments before had been seen as a threat was now recognized as the son of one of the most prominent residents of the condominium. While the policeman hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events, Elijah remained lying on the ground, his face pressed against the asphalt. Silent tears ran down his cheeks, mixing with sweat and dust. At that moment, he was neither the son of a famous doctor nor a promising student. He was just a frightened boy, unfairly brutalized because of the color of his skin. The tension in the air was palpable. The locals who had previously looked on with indifference now seemed uneasy, some even ashamed. The injustice of what they had witnessed, and in some cases encouraged, was painfully clear. But this shocking scene was only the beginning. What no one present could have predicted was how this seemingly isolated incident would set in motion a series of events that would expose the hidden layers of prejudice, privilege, and secrets long buried in Oak Ridge Heights. As sirens echoed in the distance, announcing the arrival of more vehicles, a question hung in the air, unspoken, but felt by all. How could this have happened here? The answer, as they would soon discover, was far more complex and disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The story of Elijah Johnson, a young black man in a world that judged him before he even met it, was just beginning. And with it would come a wave of revelations that would shake the foundations not only of Oak Ridge Heights, but of an entire society built on foundations of inequality and prejudice. The sun was already setting over the Atlanta skyline when Dr. Marcus Johnson parked his Mercedes in the driveway of his mansion in Oak Ridge Heights. The 45-year-old heart surgeon let out a tired sigh, massaging his temples as he turned off the engine. It had been another exhausting day at the hospital, saving lives and fighting the clock. But not even tiredness could erase the gleam of pride in his brown eyes, pride in his profession, his family, and the life he had built. Upon entering the house, Marcus was greeted by the comforting aroma of a home-cooked dinner and the sound of voices coming from the kitchen. His wife, Olivia, a successful lawyer, was preparing the table with the help of their youngest son, 10-year-old Nathan. Marcus' face lit up at the sight of his family, but a shadow of concern crossed his features when he noticed Elijah's absence. "Where's Elijah?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual as he hung up his coat. Olivia exchanged a quick glance with Nathan before answering. "He's not back from his friends yet. He said he'd be home for dinner." Marcus checked his watch, feeling a twinge of anxiety. It wasn't like Elijah to be late without warning. He picked up his cell phone, ready to call his son, when the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house, charged with an inexplicable urgency. Marcus walked to the door, his heart racing with every step. When he opened it, the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Elijah was there, but not alone. 2 policemen flanked him, their faces a mask of discomfort and embarrassment. His son's face was tear-stained, his eyes red and swollen. His clothes, once impeccable, were dirty and crumpled. "Dr. Johnson?" one of the officers asked, his voice tense. "There was an incident this afternoon involving your son." The officer's next words were lost in a distant hum, as Marcus absorbed the scene in front of him. His son, his pride, his Elijah, had been subjected to the nightmare that every black father dreads. The cruel reality that Marcus had always hoped would protect his children fell on him with the weight of 1,000 bricks. In the minutes that followed, Marcus listened to Elijah's interspersed account of what had happened. Every word was like a stab in his heart. The humiliation, the fear, the injustice, it all painted a picture that Marcus knew all too well, not just from his own experiences, but from the countless stories circulating in his community. As Olivia hugged Elijah, her own tears mingling with her son's, Marcus turned to the officers. His voice, normally calm and compassionate, trembled with restrained anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The trauma you've caused my son?" The older officer, a middle-aged man with grey hair, had the decency to look ashamed. "Dr. Johnson, there's been a misunderstanding. We received a call about a suspect." "A suspect?" Marcus interrupted him, his voice rising in volume. "My son was walking in his own neighborhood. Since when is that suspicious?" The silence that followed was deafening. The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly not knowing how to respond. The implicit truth hung in the air. Elijah had been considered suspicious simply for being black in a predominantly white neighborhood. At that moment, all the anger and frustration that Marcus had suppressed over the years came flooding out. He was a respected man, a renowned surgeon who saved lives on a daily basis. But none of that mattered when it came to the color of his skin or that of his son. "I want names," Marcus demanded, his voice now cold and controlled. "Names of all the officers involved, the dispatcher who took the call, and the person who filed the complaint. It won't stay that way." The officers hesitated, but faced with the determination in Marcus' gaze, they reluctantly agreed to provide the information. As they left, Marcus closed the door and turned to his family. Olivia was still hugging Elijah, murmuring words of comfort. Nathan watched the scene with wide eyes, his innocence shaken by the harsh reality his brother had faced. Marcus joined in the embrace, wrapping his family in his strong arms. "We'll get through this," he promised, his voice soft but firm. "And we'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Not just to you, Elijah, but to any other child." That evening, as the Johnson family gathered in the living room, a difficult but necessary conversation began to unfold. Marcus and Olivia shared their own experiences of racism, stories they had kept under wraps in the hope of protecting their children. Elijah, still shaken, found comfort in his parents' words and in the presence of his family. The discussion lasted well into the night, touching on complex topics such as privilege, institutional prejudice, and the need for change. For Nathan, it was an abrupt introduction to realities that his parents had hoped to postpone for a few more years. For Elijah, it was a painful initiation into the world that awaited him outside the walls of Oak Ridge Heights. As the night wore on, Marcus made a decision. He would not allow the incident to be swept under the carpet. As a respected leader in the community, he would use his voice and influence to bring about real change. "Tomorrow," he announced, his voice laden with determination, "we're going to start taking action. We're going to talk to our neighbors, to the neighborhood association, to the police department. This can't keep happening." Olivia nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and concern. "It won't be easy, Marcus. Many people prefer to ignore these problems, to pretend they don't exist." "I know," Marcus replied, looking at his children. "But if we do nothing, nothing will change. And I refuse to accept a world where my children are judged by the color of their skin and not by the content of their character." As the family prepared for bed, a feeling of unity and purpose hung in the air. The incident with Elijah had been a brutal awakening, but also a catalyst for change. The Johnson family was ready to face the challenge ahead, not just for themselves, but for an entire community that had long suffered in silence. Outside, the streets of Oak Ridge Heights were silent, seemingly unaffected by the day's events. But beneath the surface, the seeds of change had been planted. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but the Johnson family was determined to walk it, step by step, towards a fairer and more equal future. The sun had barely risen when Elijah Johnson woke up, his eyes still heavy from restless sleep. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that the events of the previous day were just a bad dream, but the pain in his wrists, where the handcuffs had left marks, brought him back to cruel reality. Sitting up in bed, Elijah looked around his room. The walls, decorated with posters of his favorite athletes and certificates of academic merit, now seemed to belong to another life. A life where he felt safe, where he believed that his effort and character were all that mattered. Now that innocence had been brutally ripped away from him. Outside, the Oak Ridge Heights neighborhood was waking up to another seemingly peaceful day. Gardeners tended to impeccable lawns, people went for their morning runs, and luxury cars left their garages for offices in downtown Atlanta. For many, it would be just another ordinary day. But for Elijah, the world had changed irrevocably. Descending the stairs, he found his parents in the kitchen. Dr. Marcus Johnson and Olivia were talking quietly, their faces tense with worry. On seeing Elijah, they both forced smiles, trying to create an atmosphere of normality. "Good morning, son," Marcus said, his voice gentle. "How are you feeling?" Elijah shrugged, unable to put into words the whirlwind of emotions that consumed him. Anger, fear, shame, all mixed together in his chest, creating a knot that seemed impossible to untie. "I don't want to go to school today," he muttered, taking a seat at the table. Olivia exchanged a glance with Marcus before approaching her son. "Elijah, we know that what happened yesterday was terrible. No one would expect you to just move on as if nothing had happened. If you need time, we understand." Marcus nodded, adding, "But we also want you to know that there's no shame in what happened. You didn't do anything wrong. The shame is on those who judged you unfairly." His parents' words, although well-meaning, seemed distant to Elijah. How could they really understand what he was feeling? The humiliation of being thrown to the ground, treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood, in front of people who had known him since he was a child. "You don't understand," Elijah said, his voice shaking. "I can't just go back to school and pretend everything's fine. Everyone will know. Everyone will look at me differently." The silence that followed was heavy. Marcus and Olivia exchanged worried glances, aware that this was only the beginning of a long journey of healing for their son. "Elijah," Marcus began, choosing his words carefully, "what happened to you is something that many young black men face every day. It's unfair, it's cruel, and it's something we need to change. But we can't let it define us or stop us from living our lives." Olivia moved closer, placing a comforting hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Your father is right. And know that we're not asking you to pretend that nothing happened. We're here to support you, to listen to you, and to fight alongside you." At that moment, Nathan, Elijah's younger brother, entered the kitchen, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Eli, are you all right? I heard Mom and Dad talking about what happened yesterday." Nathan's presence brought a new dimension to the conversation. Elijah looked at his younger brother, feeling a wave of protection. How could he protect Nathan from the cruel world he had encountered? How could he preserve his brother's innocence when his own had been so brutally destroyed? "I'm fine, Nate," Elijah replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't worry about me." Marcus, sensing the dynamic between the brothers, decided it was time for a broader conversation. "I think it's important that we all talk about what happened and what we can do about it." In the minutes that followed, the Johnson family gathered in the living room. Marcus and Olivia shared their own experiences of racism, stories they had kept under wraps in the hope of protecting their children. Elijah, still reluctant, began to open up about his feelings, about the fear and anger that consumed him. "I always thought that if I tried hard enough, if I was a good student and a good son, that would be enough," Elijah vented, tears streaming down his face. "But yesterday I realized that for some people, none of that matters. They only see my color." Marcus' heart squeezed when he heard his son's words. He knew all too well the pain of this awakening, the cruel reality of realizing that, in the eyes of some, your worth was determined by the color of your skin. "Elijah," Marcus said, his voice firm but gentle, "what happened to you is a reflection of the deep problems in our society, not a reflection of who you are. You are a bright, compassionate young man, full of potential. Don't let the ignorance and prejudice of others diminish your value." Olivia, a lawyer by profession, added, "And know that we will not let this go unnoticed. We're going to take legal action. We're going to demand changes in the police department, and we're going to use our voice to make sure this doesn't happen again, not just to you, but to any other young person." As the conversation unfolded, Elijah began to feel a spark of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. His family was by his side, ready to face injustice head-on. "What can we do?" Nathan asked, his voice small but determined. "I want to help too." Nathan's question brought a smile to Marcus' lips. "There's a lot we can do, son. We can educate our neighbors, participate in community meetings, support organizations that fight against racism and police violence, and above all, we can continue to be who we are, showing the world that we deserve respect and equality." As the family discussed plans and ideas, Elijah felt something change inside him. The pain and fear were still there, but now there was something else: determination. He realized that his experience, however painful, could be a catalyst for change. "I want to go back to school," Elijah suddenly said, surprising everyone. "I want to tell my story. I want people to know what happened and why it's wrong." Pride shone in Marcus and Olivia's eyes. Their son was choosing to face adversity head-on, turning his pain into purpose. "We're with you, Elijah," Marcus said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Every step of the way." As the Johnson family prepared to face the day, a new energy filled the house. The incident that could have broken them was instead uniting them in a common mission. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, full of obstacles and challenges, but they were determined to walk it together, not just for themselves, but for all those who faced similar injustices every day. Outside, The sun was rising in the Atlanta sky, promising a new day. For the Johnson family, it was more than that. It was the beginning of a journey of change, an opportunity to turn pain into purpose and silence into action. And they were ready to face every challenge that came their way, united and determined to make a difference. The silence in the car was palpable as Dr. Marcus Johnson drove towards Woodward Academy, where Elijah studied. Next to him, Elijah kept his gaze fixed on the window, watching the familiar streets of Atlanta pass by in a blur. Each block seemed loaded with new threats, shadows where before there was only light. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Marcus asked, casting a worried glance at his son. Elijah nodded, although his stomach was in knots. "I have to do this, Dad. I can't let them win." The words sounded brave, but Marcus could hear the underlying tremor in his son's voice. In the 2 days since the incident, he had observed subtle changes in Elijah. The cheerful, carefree boy who used to fill the house with laughter now seemed withdrawn, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings for invisible threats. When they arrived at the school, Marcus parked the car and turned to Elijah. "Remember, son, you're not alone in this. If you need anything, at any time, call me. He'll come right away." Elijah nodded, gathering his courage before opening the car door. As he walked towards the school entrance, he could feel the stares of the other students. Whispers followed him, and he couldn't help wondering how many of them knew what had happened. In the classroom, Mrs. Hernandez, his history teacher, welcomed him with a kind smile. "Welcome back, Elijah. We missed you." Elijah forced a smile, grateful for the normalcy that Mrs. Hernandez was trying to maintain. But as the class progressed, he found himself unable to concentrate. Every sudden movement, every loud sound startled him. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to take notes. During the break, Elijah made his way to his locker, trying to ignore the stares and whispers around him. It was then that he heard a familiar voice. "Hey, Elijah, is it true what they're saying? That the police caught you?" It was Tyler, a classmate Elijah used to talk to about basketball. The question, although probably well-intentioned, hit Elijah like a punch in the gut. I don't want to talk about it," Elijah muttered, closing his locker more tightly than he intended. Tyler seemed to notice Elijah's discomfort. "Sorry, man. Everyone's talking, you know?" Elijah nodded stiffly, feeling a wave of nausea. The idea that his humiliation was now the topic of school gossip made him want to disappear. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety and discomfort. Every glance, every whisper seemed laden with judgment. In PE class, Elijah found himself unable to change in the changing room, the fear of exposing the marks on his wrists overcoming his desire to participate. When he finally arrived home, Elijah rushed to his room, ignoring his mother's worried questions. Closing the door, he let himself fall onto the bed, the tears he had been holding back all day finally escaping. Minutes later, a soft knock sounded on the door. "Elijah?" It was the voice of his mother, Olivia. "May I come in?" After a moment's hesitation, Elijah mumbled a muffled, "Yes." Olivia entered, taking a seat on the edge of the bed. Her eyes were full of concern and love. "It's been a hard day, hasn't it?" she asked softly. Elijah nodded, unable to find the words to express the whirlwind of emotions that was consuming him. Olivia sighed, placing a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "Elijah, what you've been through, what you're going through, is something no young person should have to face. But I want you to know that there's no shame in feeling shaken by it. It's normal and it's valid." His mother's words seemed to open a floodgate inside Elijah. "I feel so powerless," he vented. "Like at any moment, it could all happen again. And everyone at school, they look at me differently now, like I'm dangerous or something." Olivia pulled Elijah into a tight hug, letting him cry on her shoulder. "Oh, my love, I'm so sorry you had to go through this. But I want you to know that your strength, your kindness, your essence, none of that has changed. What has changed is the perception of others, and that says more about them than it does about you." As Elijah calmed down in his mother's arms, Marcus entered the room, his eyes filled with pain at seeing his son so shaken. "I think we need to consider getting professional help," Marcus said softly. "A therapist who can help Elijah process all of this." Elijah turned away, looking at his father with a mixture of fear and shame. "I don't need a therapist. I'm not crazy." "Son," Marcus knelt beside the bed, meeting Elijah's gaze. "Getting help doesn't mean you're crazy. It means you're strong enough to recognize that some wounds are too deep to heal alone." Olivia nodded, adding, "Also, there are support groups for young people who have been through similar experiences. It might be good for you to talk to others who understand exactly what you're feeling." Elijah considered his parents' words. The idea of talking about his feelings with a stranger scared him, but at the same time, the weight he was carrying seemed too heavy to bear alone. I think I can try," he finally agreed, his voice low but determined. Marcus smiled, proud of his son's courage. "We're here with you, Elijah, every step of the way." That evening, as the Johnson family dined together, there was a feeling of togetherness that was stronger than ever. Nathan, noticing his brother's gloomy mood, made jokes and told funny stories from school, managing to get a few genuine smiles out of Elijah. Later, lying on his bed, Elijah reflected on the day. The fear and anxiety were still there, lurking in the shadows of his mind. But there was also a spark of hope. The certainty of his family's love and support, the prospect of seeking professional help, all offered a glimpse of a way forward. As sleep finally enveloped him, Elijah made a silent promise to himself. He would not let this experience define him or break him. With the support of his family and the help he needed, he would find a way to turn this pain into strength, this injustice into purpose. The road ahead would be long and difficult, full of challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But Elijah Johnson was determined to walk it, one step at a time, towards the healing and change that he and so many others like him deserved. The sun had barely risen when the first voices began to echo through the streets of Oak Ridge Heights. What began as a murmur soon turned into a powerful chorus of outrage and hope. Posters reading "Justice for Elijah" and "Black Lives Matter" colored the once dull landscape of the upper-class neighborhood. At the center of this maelstrom was the Johnson family. Marcus, Olivia, and Elijah walked side by side, their hands intertwined in a silent show of unity. Around them, neighbors, schoolmates, and even strangers joined in, forming a growing mass of support. "I never imagined I'd see something like this in Oak Ridge Heights," Olivia whispered to Marcus, her eyes watering with emotion. Marcus nodded, his expression a mixture of pride and determination. "It's time to break the silence, darling. Our son deserves it. All young black men deserve it." As the march progressed through the tree-lined streets of the neighborhood, more and more people joined in. Windows opened, curious faces peered out, some hesitant, others openly supportive. The news of the incident with Elijah had spread like wildfire, touching an exposed nerve in the community. In a particularly powerful moment, the march stopped in front of the local police station. There, community leaders and activists took the floor, their voices amplified by megaphones. "We can no longer pretend that this isn't happening in our backyard," shouted Reverend James, a respected local pastor. "Police violence against our young black men is a reality we can no longer ignore. It's time to demand change." Applause and shouts of support echoed through the street. Elijah, who until then had remained silent, felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Seeing so many people gathered together, fighting for him and others like him, was overwhelming. As the speeches continued, Marcus noticed a group of young people approaching. They were Elijah's classmates, led by Tyler, the friend who had questioned Elijah about the incident days before. "Mr. Johnson," Tyler said, his voice shaking slightly, We wanted to apologize to Elijah. We didn't understand before, but now we want to help. How can we make a difference?" Marcus smiled, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You're already doing it, Tyler. Being here, showing support, that's the first step. As the day progressed, the mobilization took on new forms. On social media, hashtags like Justice for Elijah and Oak Ridge Contra O-Racism gained traction, drawing national attention to the case. Videos and photos of the march spread quickly, inspiring discussion and debate across the country. In a nearby square, a group of residents organized an impromptu community meeting. There, people of all ages and backgrounds shared their experiences and ideas on how to combat racism and police violence. "We need more training for our police officers," argued an elderly woman. "They need to learn to see beyond the color of their skin." "What about representation?" asked a young university student. "How many black officers do we have in our local police force?" Soon, the discussions were heated but constructive. For the first time in a long time, Oak Ridge Heights was having difficult but necessary conversations. As the sun began to set, the community's energy did not wane. Groups were forming to plan future actions, petitions, educational programs, awareness-raising initiatives. The struggle had only just begun, but the sense of unity and purpose was palpable. Back at the Johnsons' house, the family gathered in the living room, exhausted but hopeful. Nathan, who had stayed with his grandparents during the day, bombarded Elijah with questions about the march. "It was amazing, Nate," Elijah replied, a genuine smile lighting up his face for the first time in days. "Seeing all those people, knowing that they care, makes all the difference." Olivia hugged her eldest son, silent tears streaming down her face. "We're so proud of you, Elijah. Your courage has inspired an entire community." Marcus, watching his family, felt a mixture of emotions. The road ahead would still be long and difficult, but today they had taken an important step. The Oak Ridge Heights community had come together, showing that change was possible. "This is just the beginning," Marcus said, his voice laden with determination. "We have a lot of work ahead of us, but together we can make a difference." As night fell over Oak Ridge Heights, a feeling of hope hung in the air. The community had found its voice and was determined to use it to fight for a fairer, more equal future. The incident with Elijah, so painful and unjust, had become a catalyst for change, uniting people from all backgrounds in a common cause. The fight against racism and police violence was far from over, but that day in Oak Ridge Heights, a spark of hope had been lit, and that spark, fueled by the determination and unity of the community, had the potential to turn into a powerful fire of change. The news spread through Oak Ridge Heights like wildfire. Dr. Marcus Johnson, the renowned heart surgeon, was the father of Elijah, the young black man brutally assaulted by the police days ago. The revelation dropped like a bombshell in the community, unleashing a wave of contradictory emotions and heated debates. At the Oak Ridge Country Club, a group of residents discussed the case in hushed tones, between sips of martini and furtive glances. "Have you seen? The boy is Dr. Johnson's son," whispered a middle-aged woman, her eyes wide with surprise. "What do you know?" replied her companion, shaking his head. "That changes everything, doesn't it?" Indeed, the revelation of Marcus' identity as Elijah's father brought a new dimension to the case. What had previously been seen as just another incident of police violence against a young black man now took on more complex contours. Marcus' social and economic position forced many to reevaluate their initial perceptions. At Elijah's school, the corridors buzzed with whispered conversations and curious looks. Tyler, the friend who days before had questioned Elijah about the incident, now found himself at the center of a heated debate with other classmates. "It just proves that it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from," Tyler argued, his voice heavy with emotion. "If you're black, you're a target." "But his father is rich and famous," countered another student. "Shouldn't that make a difference?" The discussion between the young people reflected a larger debate taking place throughout the community. The intersection between race and social class, so often ignored, was now laid bare before everyone. At an emergency meeting of the neighborhood association, opinions were divided. Some argued that Marcus' status should have protected Elijah, while others insisted that the incident only proved how deeply ingrained racism was in society. If even the son of a respected doctor isn't safe, "What hope is there for the rest of us?" asked one black resident, his voice shaking with emotion. The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable, forcing many to confront their own assumptions and prejudices. Meanwhile, at the Johnsons' home, the family was dealing with the consequences of the revelation. Elijah, sitting on the porch with his father, struggled to process his emotions. "Dad," he began hesitantly, "do you think it would have been different if they'd known who I was all along?" Marcus sighed, placing a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. "Maybe, son. And that's exactly what makes it so wrong. No young person should be treated like that, regardless of who their parents are." The conversation between father and son captured the essence of the dilemma that now confronted Oak Ridge Heights. The revelation of Marcus' identity not only changed the narrative of the incident, but also opened up space for a deeper examination of the injustices rooted in society. On social media, the debate intensified. Hashtags like #privilege, does not protect, and #racism, does not have class, gained traction, taking the discussion beyond the confines of Oak Ridge Heights. Activists and community leaders seized the moment to broaden the conversation. In an interview with local media, Dr. Angela Carter, a sociologist and activist, offered her perspective. The case of young Elijah Johnson forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Racism transcends social class. Even those who have achieved success and recognition are not immune to the prejudices deeply rooted in our society. As the community digested this new information, many began to question their own attitudes and behavior. Difficult but necessary conversations began to emerge in homes, schools, and workplaces. At the local church, Reverend James dedicated his Sunday sermon to the topic, challenging his congregation to look beyond appearances. We cannot judge a person's worth by the color of their skin or the size of their bank account. Every life is precious in God's eyes, and we should treat it as such. As night fell over Oak Ridge Heights, the community found itself at a turning point. The revelation about Marcus and Elijah had stripped away layers of complacency and denial, exposing the complexities of race and class relations that had been ignored for so long. For Elijah, the experience was bittersweet. On the one hand, the support and attention was comforting. On the other, he couldn't help but wonder why his pain only seemed to matter now that his connection to Marcus was known. "I don't just want to be defined as Dr. Johnson's son," he confessed to his mother, Olivia, that night. "I want to be seen for who I am." Olivia hugged her son, her own emotions running high. "You're so much more than that, Elijah. And together, let's make sure the world sees that too." As Oak Ridge Heights prepared for bed, one thing was clear. The community had been irrevocably changed. The revelation about Marcus and Elijah had opened a Pandora's box of questions about race, class, and identity. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, there was a palpable sense that real change was possible. The story of Elijah Johnson, a young black man in a world that judged him before he even met it, continued to unfold. But now, with each chapter, new voices joined the chorus, demanding justice, equality, and above all, recognition of everyone's shared humanity. The office of Atlanta's District Attorney, John Hawkins, was immersed in a tense silence. Sitting at his mahogany desk, Hawkins was carefully examining the reports on the incident involving Elijah Johnson. His tired eyes scanned the pages, absorbing every detail, every inconsistency. "This can't go on like this," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his gray hair. The door opened, and his assistant Rachel entered with a stack of folders. "Sir, here are the files you requested on previous cases of police abuse." Hawkins nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Rachel. What about the body cameras?" "The footage arrived an hour ago. They're being analyzed by the technical team now." The prosecutor sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The Elijah Johnson case had become a turning point, not just for Oak Ridge Heights, but for the entire Atlanta justice system. Meanwhile, at the Atlanta Police Department, the Chief of Police, Robert Sullivan, was facing his own whirlwind. An emergency meeting had been called with senior officers. "Gentlemen," Sullivan began, his deep voice echoing through the conference room. "We are facing a crisis. The incident with young Johnson has exposed serious flaws in our protocols and training." The officers exchanged tense glances. The case had shaken the community's confidence in the police force, and everyone knew that drastic changes were coming. "Starting today," Sullivan continued, "all officers will undergo intensive training on implicit bias and appropriate use of force. In addition, we are implementing a new system of oversight and accountability." Back at the DA's office, Hawkins received an important call. It was Marcus Johnson. "Dr. Johnson," Hawkins greeted, his voice mixing respect and caution. "How can I help you?" "District Attorney Hawkins," Marcus' voice sounded firm on the other end of the line. "I want to know what steps are being taken to hold the officers involved in the attack on my son accountable." Hawkins took a deep breath before answering. "Dr. Johnson, I can assure you that we are taking this case very seriously. We are analyzing all the evidence, including the body camera footage. The officers involved have been removed from active duty while the investigation is ongoing." "It's not enough," Marcus retorted, his voice laden with restrained emotion. "We need systemic changes, not just individual punishments." The conversation continued for a few minutes, with Hawkins explaining the next steps in the legal process and Marcus expressing his concerns and demands for wider reforms. Meanwhile, in the Oak Ridge Heights community, a grassroots movement was gaining momentum. Led by Olivia Johnson and other local activists, a civilian oversight committee was being formed to monitor police actions and promote transparency. At a packed community meeting at the local community center, Olivia took the floor. "We can no longer rely solely on existing institutions to protect us," she declared, her voice resonating through the room. "We need to be active in our own security and in holding those who are sworn to protect us accountable." The committee's proposal was met with enthusiastic applause. The idea of having community members directly involved in overseeing police activities seemed to offer tangible hope for real change. Back at the police department, Chief Sullivan faced resistance from some older officers regarding the new measures. "Chief, with all due respect," argued a veteran sergeant, "these new rules are going to tie our hands. How can we do our jobs effectively?" Sullivan looked the sergeant straight in the eye. "Our job is to protect and serve. If we can't do that without violating the rights of the citizens we're sworn to protect, then we're not doing our job properly." As night fell over Atlanta, the wheels of justice and reform continued to turn. In the DA's office, Hawkins finally came to a decision. He was going to recommend criminal charges against the officers involved in the incident with Elijah. "Rachel," he called to his assistant, "get the documents ready. Let's move this along." Dirty. At home, Elijah sat with his parents, discussing the day's events. The news of the possible charges against the officers brought a mixture of relief and apprehension. "It's a start," Marcus said, hugging his son. "But the fight for real justice and systemic change is far from over." Olivia nodded, adding, "And we'll be there, every step of the way, not just for you, Elijah, but for all the young people who face similar injustices every day." As the Johnson family prepared for bed, the city of Atlanta, and in particular the Oak Ridge Heights community, were on the verge of a transformation. Elijah's case had become a catalyst for long overdue changes in the way the law was applied and how the community interacted with those charged with protecting it. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in a long time, there was a palpable sense of hope in the air. The fight for justice, equality, and accountability had only just begun, but the seeds of change had been planted, ready to blossom into a more just and equitable future for all. The auditorium at Atlanta University was packed. Students, professors, activists, and community members crowded around, eager for the forum, Pathways to Change, Rethinking Public Safety, to begin. On stage, a table of panelists awaited, including Marcus Johnson, Olivia, Police Chief Sullivan, and Dr. Angela Carter, sociologist and activist. The moderator, a respected local journalist, began the discussion. "Good evening, everyone. We are here to discuss concrete solutions to the challenges our community faces in relation to police violence and racial inequality. Dr. Johnson, as someone directly affected by these problems, what do you believe is the first step towards real change? Marcus leaned into the microphone, his voice firm and determined. The first step is to recognize that the problem is systemic. We can't settle for superficial solutions. We need a complete overhaul of the police force, starting with training. Chief Sullivan, visibly uncomfortable but determined to participate in the dialogue, added, "I agree that changes are needed. We've already started an intensive training program on implicit bias and appropriate use of force, but this is only the beginning." Olivia, with her legal experience, intervened. "Training is crucial, but we also need accountability. I propose the creation of an independent civilian oversight committee with real power to investigate and recommend disciplinary action." Olivia's proposal was met with enthusiastic applause from the audience. Dr. Carter, seizing the moment, added, "In addition, we need to address the roots of inequality. Investments in education, health, and employment opportunities in marginalized communities are key to reducing crime and improving relations with the police." As the discussion progressed, concrete ideas began to take shape. Chief Sullivan, initially defensive, began to open up to suggestions. "I'm willing to implement a community policing pilot program. Officers dedicated to specific neighborhoods, working closely with local leaders to build trust." The proposal was met with cautious interest. A young man in the audience raised his hand. "What about the demilitarization of the police? It often feels like we're being treated like enemies in a war zone." The comment generated murmurs of agreement. Chief Sullivan hesitated before responding. "It's a valid concern. We can review our response protocols and equipment. The goal should be to de-escalate situations, not intensify them." Marcus, seeing a bridging opportunity, added, "Perhaps we could organize regular meetings between officers and members of the community, not just in crisis situations, but to build relationships and mutual understanding." And the idea seemed to resonate with everyone present. Olivia, ever practical, suggested, "We could start with a pilot program in Oak Ridge Heights. If it's successful, it could serve as a model for other communities." As the forum drew to a close, there was a palpable sense of hope in the air. People left not just with ideas, but with concrete plans of action. In the weeks that followed, the Oak Ridge Heights community became a laboratory for change. The Civilian Oversight Committee proposed by Olivia was established, with representatives from various sectors of the community. Chief Sullivan's community policing program began to take shape, with officers attending local events and building relationships with residents. Elijah, inspired by the events, decided to become more active in the fight for change. He began leading a youth group focused on civic education and rights awareness. "We can't expect adults to solve everything," he said at a group meeting. "We are the future, and we need to be informed and engaged." Marcus and Olivia, seeing their son's growth and determination, felt a mixture of pride and concern. The fight for justice and equality was arduous, but seeing Elijah turn his pain into purpose was deeply inspiring. Meanwhile, at the police academy, new training modules were being implemented. Veteran officers and recruits alike were going through workshops on racial history, implicit bias, and de-escalation techniques. One day, during one of these sessions, a veteran officer shared, "I always thought I was doing the right thing, following protocol. But now I see how my actions may have negatively impacted the people I was sworn to protect. I am here to learn and do better." The journey of change wasn't easy. There was resistance, setbacks, and moments of frustration. But with every small step forward, every difficult conversation, every barrier broken, the Oak Ridge Heights community grew stronger. 6 months after the incident with Elijah, the city held a candlelight vigil in memory of all the victims of police violence. Hundreds of people gathered, holding candles and signs with messages of hope and unity. Marcus, holding hands with Olivia and Elijah, looked out over the diverse crowd. He saw police officers standing side by side with activists, elderly people talking to teenagers, neighbors who previously barely spoke to each other, now united for a common cause. "We still have a long way to go," he thought. "But today, at this moment, I see the start of something truly transformative." As the candle flames flickered in the evening breeze, illuminating the determined faces around them, Marcus felt a surge of hope. The seeds of change had been planted, and with care, dedication, and perseverance, they would blossom into a more just and equitable future for all. Elijah Johnson's story, which began with an act of injustice, had become a catalyst for progress. And as the Oak Ridge Heights community continued its journey of healing and transformation, his experience became a beacon of hope for other communities across the country, proving that with dialogue, empathy, and collective action, change was not only possible, but inevitable. What would you do if you were in his shoes? What do you think about the way society treats young black people? These questions make us think. The fight for equality and respect is a battle we all have to face. So how can we change this reality? What steps should we take to ensure that no one goes through what this young man went through? His story must not be forgotten. Share your thoughts in the comments and keep the conversation going. Together, we can make a difference. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.